we all grieve differently. Myself, my son, Meghan. It's been a emotional roller coaster. I'm exhausted spiritually, mentally, physically. So it's taken a great toll on all of us, and we're still navigating grief, where it's going to take us.
What do you tell yourself about why this happened?
Oh, I don't know the answer. I really wish Karmelo would have testified. So that's the big question: is why? And since he chose not to testify, I'll never know that answer.
And you say that that haunts you, because what would that mean to you to know?
No, it actually doesn't haunt me. It is what it is. I don't care what reason you give me. My son's gone. He's never going to walk through the door again and hug me. So realistically, I don't give it a second thought. We're moving forward. We're not looking in the past. So I need to focus on my other son and my own mental health, and just move forward and keep Austin's legacy alive for as long as I live.
How does it affect this situation that they weren't just brothers, they were twins, and of course his brother was there and witnessed all of this?
I can't imagine, first of all, having a brother murdered in front of me and then actually holding him in my arms trying to make the blood stop. I can't fathom what my son is going through and went through. I know during the court trial, there was some body cam footage played, and I could hear him screaming in the background. Oh my God, someone help. It's my twin, it's my best friend. Coach, help, help, God please, help, help. That was probably the most painful part of the entire trial, because I had never had access to that before. I had seen the video of the event, but never the body cam footage, and it really it rocked me to my core.
He was on the ground inside a stadium packed with student athletes, coaches, and officials. A rainy Wednesday morning in Frisco, Texas. Over 100 teenagers from 8 different schools were there that day, competing, warming up, waiting out the weather. And in the middle of all of it, one boy was dying. His twin brother dropped to his knees beside him, pressing his hands against the wound, screaming for someone, anyone, to help. Coaches rushed over. Students froze. First responders were called. CPR was performed. Blood was administered right there on the scene. It was not enough. 2 teenagers, same city, same sport, same age. They had never met before that morning. And before the clock hit noon, one of them was gone and the other was left holding him, begging God to intervene. This case shook an entire community, divided a nation, and forced every person who followed it to ask one question. How does something like this happen in broad daylight, in a stadium full of witnesses, at a high school track meet? That is what we are here to answer today. But to understand what happened inside that stadium, we have to go back to the people at the center of it. Austin Metcalf was 17 years old and a junior at Frisco Memorial High School in Frisco, Texas. By every measure, he was exactly the kind of kid that people point to when they talk about young people doing it right. He carried a 4.0 grade point average. He was the MVP of his football team. He had college on the horizon and a future that his family had every reason to believe in. He was not just a student athlete. He was a young man who had built a reputation in his school and in his community as someone people could count on. His mother, Meghan Metcalf, described him as a peacemaker and a protector. Those were not just words chosen for a eulogy. People who knew Austin said that is exactly who he was. Someone who stepped in when things went wrong, someone who looked out for the people around him. That instinct, as it turns out, would place him directly in the path of what happened on April 2nd, 2025. Austin was not an only child. He had a twin brother named Hunter Metcalf. The two of them shared everything that twins share: a birthday, a household, a school district, and by all accounts, an unbreakable bond. Hunter was also at the track meet that morning. He was there, competing alongside his brother, surrounded by teammates and coaches, on what should have been a completely ordinary Wednesday. Hunter Metcalf's story does not end on April 2nd, 2025. In many ways, it begins there. His journey through the aftermath of that day, the grief, the anger, and eventually what he describes as forgiveness, runs through this entire case from the moment it started to the moment the verdict was read. Their father, Jeff Metcalf, is a man who, by his own description, was raised with old school values. He talks about faith, about moral compass, about the kind of parenting that shapes who a child becomes. He is a Christian, and that faith becomes one of the most significant threads running through this story. Not because it softens what happened, but because of how it shaped the way he chose to carry it. Jeff Metcalf became the public face of this family. He spoke when others stayed silent. He pushed back when the narrative around his son's death started moving in directions he never asked for and never wanted. Meghan Metcalf, Austin's mother, co-parented alongside Jeff. She has described the loss of her son in terms that are impossible to argue with. Her words, delivered at the most critical moment of this case, will be heard later in this documentary exactly as she intended them: raw, direct, and without filter. On the other side of this case is Karmelo Anthony. At the time of the incident, he was also 17 years old and a senior at Frisco Centennial High School, a different school in the same Frisco Independent School District. He and Austin Metcalf lived in the same city, competed under the same district banner, and had never once crossed paths before the morning of April 2nd, 2025. There is no prior history between them, no previous conflict, no bad blood. Two strangers in the same stadium on the same rainy morning. Karmelo Anthony's mother is Kayla Hayes. She stood by her son throughout this entire process. Her role in this story comes later. These are the people at the center of one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Texas in recent memory. On the morning of April 2nd, 2025, all of these lives collided at one location, David Kuykendall Stadium in Frisco, Texas. And what happened next would make national headlines within hours. April 2, 2025 started like any other competition day in the Frisco Independent School District. The 11-5A District Championship track meet was scheduled at David Kuykendall Stadium, a well-known venue in Frisco, Texas, just north of Dallas. Over 100 student athletes from 8 different schools had shown up that morning to compete. Coaches lined the field. Officials managed the schedule. Students warmed up, stretched, and waited for their events to be called. It was a Wednesday morning, and it was supposed to be about running, times, and field distances, and which school walked away with the district title. Then the weather changed everything. A rainstorm moved in and forced a delay. With the track wet and conditions unsafe for competition, athletes were directed to shelter. This is where the sequence of events that ended Austin Metcalf's life began. Not with a confrontation, not with a threat, but with a rainstorm and a tent. Memorial High School had a team tent set up in the bleacher area of the stadium. It was their designated space for their athletes to gather and wait out the weather. Frisco Centennial High School, the school Karmelo Anthony attended, did not have a tent available. When the rain picked back up, Anthony made his way under Memorial High School's tent. Hunter Metcalf noticed first. He approached Anthony and asked him to move. Anthony refused. This was not an aggressive confrontation at this point. It was a request, and it was denied. What followed was a back and forth that witnesses later described to investigators and to the jury in detail. According to testimony presented at trial, Anthony was asked to leave that tent approximately 15 times. 15. He did not move. Austin Metcalf then stepped in directly. As the peacemaker and protector his mother had always described him to be, Austin confronted Anthony himself. The two teenagers stood face to face, strangers, same age, same district, meeting for the first and last time under a team tent during a rain delay at a high school track meet. What happened next unfolded fast. The argument between Austin and Anthony escalated. At some point during the confrontation, Anthony issued a verbal warning. According to witnesses who testified, Anthony told Metcalf words to the effect of, "Touch me and see what happens." Austin Metcalf shoved him. Witnesses described the shove as landing on Anthony's shoulder area, made with both hands. It was not a punch. It was not a weapon. It was a shove. Anthony reached into his bag. He pulled out a black-handled folding knife and drove it into Austin Metcalf's chest. One stab, one motion. Austin collapsed. Anthony did not stay. He moved away from the tent and began making his way across the stadium grounds. Students who had witnessed what just happened immediately reacted. Some gave chase. Others began directing arriving officers toward Anthony, pointing him out across the stadium property. Emergency services were called to Kuykendall Stadium. First responders arrived and began life-saving measures on the scene. CPR was performed. Blood was administered in an attempt to stabilize Austin. Everything that could be done in those minutes was done. It was not enough to save him. Hunter Metcalf was there. He reached his brother. He held Austin in his arms and pressed against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. He stayed with him. Austin Metcalf died there, at the stadium, in the arms of his twin brother, surrounded by the chaos of a competition day that had turned into something no one at that stadium was prepared for. Karmelo Anthony was arrested on school property within minutes of the stabbing. Officers located him quickly, in large part because students on the scene had tracked his movements and guided law enforcement directly to him. When officers took Anthony into custody, one of them referred to him as the alleged suspect. Anthony responded immediately. He said, "I am not alleged, I did it." He then asked whether what he had done could be considered self-defense and whether Austin Metcalf was okay. Austin Metcalf was not okay. Austin Metcalf was gone. Frisco ISD later confirmed that surveillance footage of the incident existed. The footage had been captured by stadium cameras. The district chose not to release it publicly. That footage would later become part of the evidence presented in court. In the hours that followed, word of what had happened at Kuykendall Stadiums spread across social media with a speed that no official statement could keep pace with. Names were shared, photos circulated, and a story that began as a local tragedy became something much larger and far more complicated. Within hours, this stadium in a Dallas suburb became the center of a national conversation that went far beyond what happened under that tent. Within minutes of Austin Metcalf's death, Frisco police had already begun securing the scene at David Kuykendall Stadium. This was not a case where investigators had to piece together what happened from fragments and guesswork. There were over 100 people present that morning. Dozens of student athletes had been in or near the bleacher area where the confrontation took place. Officers moved quickly. The knife used in the stabbing was recovered. Witness statements began to be collected from students, coaches, and officials who had been on the grounds, and the process of building an evidentiary record started almost immediately. Frisco ISD cooperated with the investigation and confirmed that surveillance footage from the stadium existed. The district made clear, however, that it would not be releasing that footage to the public. The footage was preserved and would eventually find its way into the hands of prosecutors as part of the formal case being built against Karmelo Anthony. What followed over the next several weeks was a thorough and deliberate investigative process led by the Collin County District Attorney's Office. DA Greg Willis did not rush to a charging decision. His team spent weeks reviewing the physical evidence, the surveillance footage, the witness accounts, and the forensic details of the case before taking the next formal step. On June 24, 2025, Willis presented the full body of evidence to a grand jury. The grand jury returned a first-degree murder indictment against Karmelo Anthony. Willis addressed the public directly after the indictment was secured. He stated that for weeks his team had been presenting evidence to the grand jury, that he had summarized that evidence and asked the grand jury to return a first-degree murder indictment, which they did. He made clear that from that point forward, the case would move fully and fairly through the court system. On the defense side, attorney Mike Howard was retained to represent Karmelo Anthony. The argument that Howard would build his entire defense around was self-defense. The position was straightforward, that Anthony had felt threatened, that the shove from Austin Metcalf had constituted a physical aggression that justified his response. It was a legal argument that would be tested extensively when the case finally reached a jury. Also stepping into the public space around this time was Dominique Alexander, president of the Next Generation Action Network. Alexander became the official spokesperson for the Anthony family, giving statements to media on their behalf and signaling clearly that this case was going to be fought on more than one front. The courtroom was one battleground. Public perception was another, and that second battleground was already out of control. By the time the indictment was handed down, the case had already exploded across social media in a way that had very little to do with the facts of what happened under that tent. Karmelo Anthony is black. Austin Metcalf was white. That detail became the lens through which millions of people online chose to view the entire case. Racial narratives dominated comment sections, news feeds, and online forums. People who had never set foot in Frisco, Texas were declaring what the case meant and what justice should look like. Before a single day of trial testimony had been heard, both legal teams stated explicitly and repeatedly that race played no role in what happened on April 2nd, 2025. Jeff Metcalf said it plainly and early. His position from day one was that this was not a black and white race issue. It was a right or a wrong issue, a human issue. He asked people not to politicize it and not to make it about race. Both things happened anyway. The consequences for the Metcalf family were severe. They became targets. Multiple swatting calls, dangerous, deliberate false emergency reports designed to send armed law enforcement to a private residence were made to their home. People connected to the case faced online threats. Doxing began. A grieving family that had just lost their son was simultaneously fighting to protect themselves from a wave of hostility they had done nothing to invite. Judge John Roach Jr. was assigned to preside over the case. Recognizing the scale of public attention and the risk it posed to a fair trial, Roach issued a gag order restricting all parties involved from making public statements about the case. He also banned all electronics from the courtroom. The trial was formally scheduled to begin June 1st, 2026, at the Collin County Courthouse in McKinney, Texas. For nearly a year, the case sat in the court system while the world outside continued to argue about it. Before we get into what happened inside that courtroom, if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. This trial had moments that even seasoned court reporters called extraordinary. You do not want to miss what comes next. Jury selection began on June 1st, 2026 at the Collin County Courthouse in McKinney, Texas. The courtroom was under strict controls from the start. Judge John Roach Jr. enforced the electronics ban he had put in place months earlier, and the gag order that had kept all parties silent for nearly a year remained in effect throughout the proceedings. The level of security and procedural caution surrounding this trial reflected exactly how much pressure had built up around the case in the 14 months since the stabbing. Before a single witness took the stand, the jury selection process itself drew attention. According to reporting from the Dallas Observer, during the selection process, every potential black juror was struck. When the 12 jurors who would ultimately decide Karmelo Anthony's fate were seated, none of them were black. That fact was reported. It is part of the public record of this trial, and it added another layer to an already deeply complicated case. It is stated here once as fact without editorializing, because it is part of the full picture of how this trial unfolded. The trial itself opened with both sides focused and disciplined. Prosecutors built their case methodically over 4 days, calling a total of 21 witnesses to the stand. That witness list included student athletes who had been present at Kuykendall Stadium on April 2, 2025, law enforcement investigators who had worked the scene and the arrest, medical experts, and character witnesses called by the defense. The courtroom heard from people who were there, people who saw what happened or parts of what happened and had carried it with them for over a year before being asked to describe it in front of a jury. Several of those student witnesses broke down in tears while testifying. These were teenagers being asked to relive one of the most traumatic experiences of their lives in a formal legal setting in a case that the entire country had been watching. The emotional weight in that courtroom during witness testimony was significant. One witness, when asked about the nature of the physical exchange between Austin Metcalf and Karmelo Anthony, described the shove Austin delivered as landing on Anthony's shoulder area, delivered with both hands. Another witness went further. That witness characterized what Anthony did in response as lethal force against non-lethal force. That phrase, lethal force against non-lethal force, became one of the most direct and impactful pieces of testimony the prosecution presented. It is also worth noting what the crowd at the stadium that morning did and did not see. Despite over 100 student athletes being present at Kuykendall Stadium, only a small number of them were positioned in a way that gave them a direct sightline to the stabbing itself. The confrontation happened in a specific section of the bleachers under that team tent, and the viewing angle was limited. The witnesses who did see it clearly were few, but what they saw, they described in detail. Law enforcement investigators took the jury through the procedural side of the case. The arrest on school grounds within minutes of the stabbing, the recovery of the black-handled folding knife used in the attack, and the statement Anthony made to officers when he was taken into custody. The investigators laid out the sequence of events from the moment the first emergency call was made to the moment Anthony was in handcuffs, and they did so with the kind of methodical precision that left very little room for ambiguity about what the physical evidence showed. Then came the body camera footage. Officers who responded to Kuykendall Stadium that morning were wearing body cameras, and that footage was entered into evidence and played for the jury inside the courtroom. What the footage captured, beyond the visual record of the scene, was audio, and in that audio, Hunter Metcalf's voice was present. He could be heard in the background in a state of complete distress, calling out for his brother, pleading for help, identifying Austin as his best friend. Jeff Metcalf was in that courtroom when that footage was played. He had seen video of the incident before, but he had never heard the body camera audio. He had never heard his surviving son's voice in those moments. He later described it as the most painful part of the entire trial, not the verdict, not the testimony, not the forensic details. That audio. Hearing Hunter in the background of footage he had not known existed. The prosecution also called Collin County Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Elizabeth Ventura, to the stand. Before she began her testimony, Judge Roach addressed the courtroom directly and warned everyone present that the information she was about to deliver was graphic in nature. The Metcalf family, who had been present throughout much of the trial, chose to leave the room before Dr. Ventura testified. What she told the jury was clinical, precise, and devastating in its clarity. Austin Metcalf had suffered a single stab wound to the chest. The wound was 2.5 inches in length. It had passed through his heart. Dr. Ventura testified that the wound was not survivable. The prosecution rested its case after 21 witnesses and 4 days of testimony. The defense then presented its case. Karmelo Anthony did not take the stand. That decision, while legally protected and strategically common, meant the jury never heard Anthony speak about what happened under that tent in his own words. The entire defense rested on the argument that Anthony had acted in self-defense, that Austin Metcalf's shove had constituted a physical threat that justified Anthony's response. Attorney Mike Howard worked to frame the events of April 2nd as a moment where his client felt cornered and afraid, and that what followed was a reaction to that fear rather than a deliberate act of murder. During closing arguments, prosecutors were direct. They called the stabbing plain and simple murder. They asked the jury to center their attention on the life that had been cut short, a 17-year-old with a 4.0 grade point average, a football MVP award, and a college future that would never happen. The defense pushed the sudden passion argument in their closing, a legal designation under Texas law that, if accepted by the jury, would have capped Anthony's potential sentence at 20 years and reframed the act as one driven by an uncontrollable emotional response rather than deliberate intent. Judge Roach instructed the jury that they were permitted to consider a lesser charge of manslaughter in addition to the murder charge. That gave the jury 3 possible paths: murder, manslaughter, or acquittal. The jury deliberated for approximately 3 hours. On June 9, 2026, they returned to the courtroom with a unanimous verdict. Guilty of murder, not manslaughter, not acquittal. Murder. The sentencing phase began almost immediately after the verdict was read. Both sides waived opening statements and moved directly into witness testimony for the punishment phase. The defense called one witness, Kayla Hayes, Karmelo Anthony's mother. She took the stand and addressed the jury with tears running down her face. She told them that Anthony was her oldest child, her firstborn, and that he would always be her baby. She confirmed that her son was sorry for what he had done and asked the jury to have mercy on him. At the defense table, Karmelo Anthony wept as his mother spoke. Then Hunter Metcalf walked into the courtroom. It was the first time he had been present during the trial proceedings. He had made the decision to appear for this moment, the sentencing phase, and he stood to deliver his victim impact statement directly to Karmelo Anthony. He asked Anthony to look at him, and then he said what 14 months of grief, anger, and survival had shaped him to say. He told Anthony that he had taken someone from him who was supposed to be an uncle, a godfather to his children, a person who was meant to be part of his entire life. He told Anthony that he had let something take over in that moment that should never have been allowed to win. When Hunter finished, he returned to his seat among friends and supporters in the courtroom and was met with embraces. Jeff Metcalf also delivered a statement. He stood before that courtroom and said what a father says when rage and faith have been living side by side inside him for over a year. At one point, he slammed his fist on the table. He was not out of control. He was precise. He was a man who had held everything together in public for 14 months and was now inside that courtroom, allowing the full weight of what had been taken from his family to be seen. The jury was then sent to deliberate on the sentence. Their first task was to determine whether the sudden passion argument applied. They rejected it. That rejection was not a small procedural detail. It was the jury stating clearly and unanimously that what Karmelo Anthony did on April 2nd, 2025 was not the result of an uncontrollable emotional surge. It was murder, and it would be sentenced as such. We are almost at the verdict. Subscribe to True Crime Exposed right now, because after this case, we have more coming that you will not find covered this thoroughly anywhere else. When the jury returned with their sentencing decision, Judge John Roach Jr. read it aloud in a courtroom that had been warned repeatedly to control its emotions. Karmelo Anthony was sentenced to 35 years in state prison for the murder of Austin Metcalf. He will be eligible for parole after serving half of that sentence. To put that in context, Anthony faced a punishment range of 5 years all the way up to 99 years or life in prison. The jury landed at 35. Some in the courtroom reacted audibly when the number was read. Anthony's attorney kept an arm around him. Anthony was then taken away. Collin County District Attorney Greg Willis spoke after the verdict and the sentence were handed down. He said that justice had been served. He credited the citizens of Collin County for their patience, their level-headedness, and their willingness to let the process work. He had asked his community a year earlier to ignore the noise surrounding the case and trust the system. On June 9, 2026, he stood before cameras and said that the system had delivered accountability. Frisco ISD also released a statement in the aftermath of the verdict. The district said it respected the judicial process and would continue to support its students with compassion and care. It acknowledged that the trial had brought strong emotions and deep grief to the community and called on everyone connected to the district to continue supporting each other with respect, sensitivity, and understanding. Within 24 hours of the verdict being read, Karmelo Anthony's legal team filed a notice of appeal. Collin County court records confirmed the filing. Attorney Mike Howard moved immediately to begin the next phase of the legal fight on Anthony's behalf. The 35-year sentence is real, but the case is not closed. An appeal means that at some point down the line, another court will be asked to review what happened inside that Collin County courtroom and determine whether the conviction and the sentence should stand. For the Metcalf family, the gag order that had silenced them for over a year was now lifted. Jeff Metcalf stepped forward and spoke publicly with a clarity and a force that only comes from someone who has spent 14 months holding back. He defended Austin's legacy directly, pushing back against the public narratives that had formed around his son's death and distorted who Austin was and what had happened to him. He addressed the sauced attacks the family had endured, deliberate, dangerous, and cowardly acts carried out against a family that was already carrying an unbearable loss. He made his position clear one final time. This case was never about race. It was about right and wrong. It was a human issue. And no amount of online outrage or political framing was ever going to change what it actually was. Meghan Metcalf also spoke. She had stayed largely out of the public eye throughout the proceedings, and when she finally addressed the world after the verdict, she said something that needed no elaboration. She said that for journalists and activists, this was a story. For her family, it was not a story. It was a reality, and it would be their reality forever. Jeff Metcalf, when asked about forgiveness, gave an answer rooted entirely in his Christian faith. He was clear that forgiving Karmelo Anthony was not the same as excusing what Anthony did. It was not a pass. It was not a declaration that what happened was acceptable. He described forgiveness as something he pursued for himself, because he understood that carrying hatred, rage, and a desire for revenge would consume him from the inside. He called it a release. He said that his faith required him to forgive, and that forgiving was the only way to stay free from becoming a prisoner of his own grief. That is not a small thing for a man to say about the person who killed his son. This case also exposed something broader that deserves to be said plainly. Social media took a tragedy involving two teenagers and turned it into a national culture war within hours, before investigators had finished processing the scene, before a grand jury had heard a single piece of evidence, before anyone outside that stadium truly understood what had happened. The speed at which millions of people formed hardened opinions based on photographs and race and assumption, rather than facts and evidence, put an already devastated family under a level of additional pressure that no grieving parent should ever have to face. Jeff Metcalf raised a question in the aftermath of all of this that goes beyond the courtroom and beyond the verdict. He talked about conflict resolution. He talked about what young people are being taught or not being taught, about de-escalation, about the choice to walk away, about understanding that some decisions cannot be undone. He pointed out that both teenagers involved that morning had options. The confrontation under that tent did not have to end the way it did. A shove did not have to be answered with a knife. And somewhere in the gap between what those two teenagers knew about handling conflict and what the moment required of them, Austin Metcalf lost his life. That question does not have a clean answer. But it is the right question to be asking. And then there is Hunter Metcalf, the twin who was there, the brother who held Austin in his final moments and then had to figure out how to keep living without the person who had been with him since before they were born. Hunter is still young. He has his entire life ahead of him, a life that will always carry the shape of what he lost on April 2nd, 2025. He showed up to that courtroom for the sentencing phase. He said what he needed to say, and then he walked back to his friends and let them hold him up. That is not a small act of courage. That is survival in real time. Karmelo Anthony is now 19 years old and heading to state prison for 35 years. Austin Metcalf is gone, and a family in Frisco, Texas is learning one day at a time how to carry something that no family should ever have to carry. True Crime Exposed covers cases that deserve more than a headline. If this documentary gave you something to think about, subscribe, share this video, leave a comment below, and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Every comment, every share, every subscription tells us to keep going. We will see you in the next one.